Okay. Bonsoir, Anin Bonjour, Tanshi, Chokma, Sahojafo Lawa Mali, Chikashasaya, Koeshta, Exa, Eshta, Njololili, Naholo Eshta, Njololili, Nahoba, Apisachili. Good evening. I'm John Hampton, the Executive Director and CEO here at the Mackenzie Art Gallery. Yakni Yapa Treaty 4 Akon. Métis, Soto, Nehewak, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, Chomat, Yakni, Otoko, Yakuke, Alani. So thank you for coming and gathering with us here on Treaty 4 territory. I started with a thank you to our host nations here. And land acknowledgements like this, like what we tend to start our programs with, can function in many ways. In their simplest forms, they're just teaching tools that is an opportunity for people in their most base sense to just know learn and know and speak the names of the traditional caretakers of these territories. And they're also a process of learning our histories to understand our present. They usually speak of treaty or elsewhere of unceded territories, or they can speak of complex treaties under duress. But intentionally or not, they always speak of the relationship that I, as the speaker, and you as the audiences here, have with that territory. And create an opportunity to ask how we're honoring and caring for that relationship. And we're here celebrating the opening of two exhibitions, Paul Seesequasis' Turning the Lens, and Deanna Bowen's Black Drones in the Hives. In Paul's work, you'll see chiefs from the Treaty 4 nations, and taken around 1919. And many of these photographs were not labeled. They don't necessarily have a history of being treated as people worth naming. And both of the exhibitions tonight take a look at archives, at the records that we keep in museums and institutions of authority, and how these records are full of story, but then also ask us to consider how these stories are held, how they're being told, who's doing the collecting and the speaking, and how the framing of these histories impacts our understanding of the present. So Paul works to upend those power dynamics in looking to shift the role of the institution as an authority or author by gathering community input to help name these community members. And Deanna poses similar questions with her deep and thoughtful investigation into Blackness in Canadian archives and weaving complex webs of interconnection into beautiful visual and emotional experiences. So as the Mackenzie, we're celebrating our 70th anniversary this year. And as we're looking back at that history that we're very proud of, then both of these projects give us that opportunity for reflection to understand what's left out of those proud histories, what we know, and allow us to re-examine our current moment and where we move from here. And the beauty of art and their practice means that you can do this on a human, relational level, with beauty, compassion, and emotion rather than a research paper, which has its place too. But I'm just honored to welcome all of you here. It's so great to see such a full audience here for these wonderful folks out in front of us. And I'm excited to invite up to the stage the incomparable Mary Ferrance, president of the Mackenzie Board of Trustees. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I want to give it up for John Hampton. Good evening, everyone. As the president of the Mackenzie Art Gallery, I am so honored to be here representing the Board of Trustees today. I want to express my sincere gratitude to everyone for being in attendance tonight. Your support of the Mackenzie Art Gallery means so much to me and so much to all of us. We believe that art can play a transformative role in society. It helps bring people together. It challenges assumptions, and it inspires new ways of thinking. Our commitment to the mission sometimes requires us to confront difficult histories. Through our exhibitions, our programs, and events, we hope to inspire reflection, conversation, and action. The Board of Trustees recognizes that this work is a responsibility that the Mackenzie Art Gallery carries due to the important role we play in the shaping of the cultural landscape of our community and beyond. We would not be able to achieve these goals without the support of individuals and organizations who share our vision. I want to extend our thanks to the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation, to the Canada Council for Arts, Sask Arts, Sask Lotteries for Sask Culture, the City of Regina, and the University of Regina. Thank you. And to the many members and individuals and organizations who give support to a vibrant cultural community right here. Our future is bright, thanks to our supporters, whose gifts to the gallery, both personally and financially, allow us to aim high and work toward new endeavors. And finally, I am delighted to introduce our Director of Programs, Crystal Mowry. Crystal is passionate in presenting the vision of artists and all of their complexity and beauty, never pulling punches, always with care and consideration. She curated Deanna Bowen's Black Drones in the Hive, while previously serving as the senior curator at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery. She has been the curatorial lead on its national tour, including its stop right here in Regina, in Crystal's most recent hometown. She has been a driving force in helping us achieve our mission and inspiring new ways forward. So please join me in welcoming Crystal to provide remarks.
No, I said, you have to stop clapping so I can turn on my mic. Welcome, everyone. It's warm in here. I know you feel that. And it's not just because spring has supposedly arrived. I think it's because there is energy in this room. And there are people ready to gather and to be present for some really important conversations and to learn together again. And I feel deeply grateful for the opportunity to be able to do that with you all here tonight and to share space with Paul and Deanna, who are now like old friends because of this table. So this table has some history from what I understand. It's a table that has witnessed some really powerful conversations and exchanges here at the gallery. And it feels like an honor to be sitting here with you both today and to maybe add to the history of this table. So as was mentioned earlier by John, it's our 70th anniversary here at the Mackenzie, and you know how anniversaries go, right? There's an opportunity to think about your past, your highlights mostly, but we're ready to think about some other things too here at the gallery, and thinking about the stories that can be told through absence, through what we don't see in our archives, what we don't see in our vaults, for example. And the desire to bring Paul together with Deanna in conversation in the galleries as well as here tonight is an opportunity for us to think through some of that absence together and what that absence may look like on a broader national scale, because I don't think our story is a particularly unique one, right? We know that there are other examples of omission that, that pepper institutional histories across this continent, really, and elsewhere. So it's not all happy times for an anniversary, but it's going to be some productive time, I think, for us too. Paul and Deanna did not know each other before this evening, and as I said, they're like old friends now. And there's so much, synergy between their practices, what they're interested in, what they're doing. And they're going to speak to that in great detail and in an engaging way. I don't need to do all of that because they're great on their own. But I think what we will be able to do is share some time thinking through the stories that can't be told, either by us or by institutions, what our personal connections are to omissions, and what autonomy looks like within these spaces. So exhibitions come together as a result of efforts made by many people. So, I'm up here with these wonderful folks who did a lot of good work, but we have lots of people working behind the scenes too to make shows happen. So we have our preparation crew, we have our education team, our development and communications folks. There's so many people that make exhibitions come into the world. And before we dig in, I really want to extend deep gratitude to some other peers, namely Erin Fay from the Nelson Museum and Gallery in BC, and Felicia Gay. So Felicia is the curatorial lead here for Paul's project, and I am going to channel a bit of Felicia's spirit here at this table because she is a wonderful force of nature, and I know if you get a chance upstairs to corner Felicia and Erin to talk about the project, they will make it come alive in a different way for you. So, the superstars who are at the table here. Paul and Deanna, I'm going to give a very brief introduction to each of them, and then we're going to get down to business. Paul is probably known to many of you folks in that his name surfaces all over the place, it seems. If it's not through the touring of the project, variations of the project that you see upstairs, the Indigenous Archive Photo Project, it may be through his book, his recent book, so Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun, which you can find in our shop as well. Paul is a writer, a cultural worker, a curator, a commentator, and he's currently based in Saskatoon. Paul curates the Indigenous Archival Photo Project, which has its roots in a social media project. So I'm sure he's going to talk a little bit about that tonight. He has a forthcoming book as well, which maybe he'll tell us a bit about as well this evening. His writings have appeared in the Globe and Mail, The Walrus, Brick, Granta, Maclean's, among other magazines. He was one of the authors to be selected and featured as part of Canada's official literary delegation for the 2021 Frankfurt International Book Fair. He's curated several photography exhibitions, including enclosing some snapshots, the photography of Métis activist James Brady, which opened at the Glenbow in Calgary in 2020. And he's also part of that has a Canadian tour, that project is a Canadian tour, but he's also a member of the Saskatchewan Writers Guild and has commented extensively on cultural issues in the media through CBC TV, APTN, Global, CTV, TV, and more. Deanna is an artist who's based in Montreal, but she has roots elsewhere in the country. She was born in Oakland, California, and has, through a variety of artistic gestures, tried to trace the Black body's movement and presence in time and space. And this is work that she's undertaken since the 1990s. She's received numerous prizes and awards, including the Scotiabank Photography Award in 2021, a Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts in 2020, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the William H. Johnson Prize. Her work has been exhibited extensively in both solo and group exhibitions, and her writing has also been published extensively. And I think maybe one of the biggest and most ambitious projects she's brought into the world in the last few years is a major anthology titled Other Places, Reflections on Media Arts in Canada. Both of these artists, these thinkers, are dynamic and productive in ways beyond what their CV tells us. And I think that's what tonight is going to be about. So I'm going to turn it over to Paul first to do a little bit of an overview of his research, and then we'll hand it over to Deanna, and then we'll do some conversation thereafter. Okay, so over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. And thank you, everyone. Atanze, thank you all for coming out. It's great to see so many faces in the crowd. We were just, Deanna and I were just commenting on that, and it's awesome to see you all here. So it's really appreciated. Hi. I'll start by just saying that this kind of work with archival photography, and I think these are just going to flip as we proceed. And you can see samples of these photos behind me right now. It began about 10 years ago. My mother, Mary Seesequasis, is from Beardy's Reserve, just outside of Duck Lake, Saskatchewan, and she was one of the witnesses for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that went through Canada a number of years ago now. She's passed now, but she was a witness at Wanuskewin when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came through and spoke on the issue of residential schools. Her schooling was completely St. Michael's Residential School, which is, it's no longer there. It burnt down a number of years ago under suspicious circumstances, but it's in Duck Lake, which is just outside of the reserve. But because my mom went to that reserve along with most of my aunts and uncles, she was pretty much, for lack of a better word, imprisoned in that school for the greater part of the year. She'd get off it to visit home in the summer or on Christmas time, etc., but most of the time she was in that school. We never talked much about the school while my mom was around. It's not a subject that she was comfortable in exploring, and I think one of the things that I've picked up from her is I'm also not comfortable in kind of digging into things that people don't want to get into. That's part of what I've felt in this work that I've been doing over the past decade, is that this respect for people's comfort zones and how you approach their story, and particularly their story as it's framed within archival imagery, photography, etc., artwork, all that sort of thing. But what really began this was a comment my mom had made a number of years ago, that at this time we were seeing a lot of imagery of residential schools, and you've all seen this imagery, and going through a lot of the testimonies and all the things were coming out about residential schools. So we were getting this very, for lack of a better word, kind of bleak framing of that whole experience that she lived the majority of her adult life through. And she just made a comment, there's another side to my life, and it's not just residential schools. And that really got me looking into this idea of reframing Indigenous imagery as we find it through archival photography. By archival photography, I mean old pictures, but pictures that are now, for lack of a better word, institutionalized at places like Library and Archives Canada, historical societies, museums, the Canadian Museum of History, etc., provincial archives like Sask Archives here, as well as historical societies, organizations like the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society, etc. All these institutions house so much of our archival past as Indigenous peoples. And part of what I think I've been trying to do with this project, the Indigenous Archival Photo Project, is to reclaim that history, to reclaim that visual history, and also to reframe it in a way that isn't just a reflection of one aspect of my mother's life, which was residential schools. And because she did not define herself by residential schools, she did not come up to people and say, I'm a residential school survivor. She was a much more complex person, as we all are, than one negative experience in our life. And this began my search into archives, looking into photos that would show another side of the reality that she lived through from being a young girl in the early 30s through the 40s, through the 50s, up to the 80s. And this was a time, of course, of the pass system, the Indian Act, residential schools, all this. But at the same time, it was also a period of resilience. It was a period of resistance, often a very quiet resistance, but a resistance nonetheless. And my mother has stories. Well, we didn't talk about residential schools. We did talk about back roads on Beardies that everyone would take to leave the reserve. No one bothered with the Indian agent and having to get the passes. They knew the roads to take to get off the reserve, to go do what they had to do and get back. And there was a kind of a culture of respectful silence around that, of how people got around it. And it was that kind of spirit and that strength that really got me looking into some of these photos. Photos, I think, that capture both the complexity of Indigenous life in its diversity, but also captured kinship and family and joy and humor and all these things that are so much a part of our families and so much a part of our sense of community. So what we have on one side are these archival photos that are in institutions, and on the other side we have our communities. And sometimes some of these photos are in our communities or were in our communities before, but in many cases they are part of the public record, they are in archives. So with the wonder of the internet, I began to post some of these photos online, primarily through Facebook. I'm not a big fan of Facebook, but that's where most of the people in the communities tend to be. And by posting some of these photos, often unnamed, often not known in the communities, people began to say, that's me, that's my uncle, that's my auntie, that's Joe from 30 years ago, he's going off hunting. And these narratives began to, in people's comments, began to connect with the image. And for me, what they did was they brought the image to life. They brought the image, they liberated the image from the institution and brought it home to the community. And I know we're just talking about photography, but for me, photography is as relevant and as much of our process of reclamation as ceremonial objects, as moccasins, as people's craft work, of any objects that are in institutions. I view photography on the same kind of plateau of relevance and importance. So people began to reclaim these stories, people began to tell these stories, and the project began to take a momentum of its own. I'm not curating this, I'm just posting them, and it's people who are telling these stories. So I want to just emphasize, part of my learning process was to not put my own interpretations on the work that I was posting, on the photographs I was posting, but to let the communities do that. I only know my family, I only know my community, and even that I only know within the peculiarities of my own upbringing. My mom was one of the first generation of Cree nurses here in Saskatchewan. And that when you go upstairs and see the exhibit, you'll see one photograph taken by, part of the exhibit is taken by, and I'll talk about her in a few minutes, Rosemary Joliet, who was a photojournalist in the late 50s, early 60s. But she has one photo in particular, which is a group of women, young women sitting around a table in Edmonton in 1954. And they're in nursing school, studying to be nurses. And this is the first generation of Indigenous women who are leaving the reserve, who are becoming professionals, who are becoming nurses. And it really is, for me, it resonated for me because that was the exact generation that my mom would. So my mom's not in that photo, she was in Humboldt, Saskatchewan, but this photo in Edmonton is that same time period, that same generation. So it resonated for me. And when you see that photo was part of a library archives collection. And all it said was basically a group of, I think the word was Aboriginal nurses at Cancel Hospital or whatever in Edmonton in 1955. But there were no names, no context. It was through the social media project that all but 2 of those women are now named. Many of those women are still active in the community. And this photo and that act of naming, to me, brings that one example, that one photograph to life. And it's in the part of this project that I think has continued. There was another exhibit in Calgary at the Glenbow a few years ago, pre-pandemic, which feels like it's 100 years ago, but it was just a few years ago. And again, it was a similar thing where we brought the photos of a photographer who was around those communities and exhibited them at the Glenbow. And at the end of that exhibition, the Glenbow handed those prints over to the Tsuut'ina Nation, so they have the prints, and it's now part of their archives. So it's this kind of reclamation and this dealing with archives, I'm sure Deanna will talk about as well, is negotiating that kind of relationship of viewing something as an object within an institution, categorized, possibly, displayed, but without the context, and bringing in that community context, and bringing in not just the community context, but the kinship of the people in that photo with the families that are still, that are here. And it's that act of visual reclamation, I think, that is the most rewarding part of the archival project, and it is an important part of it. One of the things you'll see upstairs, and I'll get into it in a bit more, is part of the project has been to tie in local photography with the Rosemary Joliet photos. So I was here about a month ago, went to I had about a week to kind of find a theme for the photos I was going to do, and I was thinking, I'm going to do something on the Regina Industrial School, or I'm going to do something about the urban migration of the 60s, because there are a lot of photos in the archives that are part of that. But those would have taken a lot of more research, a protocol, permissions, all those things, which there was not the time to do. And fortunately, just as often happens in this work, the Rossi photos, which you'll see upstairs, all taken in Regina, all taken likely, we believe, in 1919 when the first official royal tour of the Prince of Wales came to Regina by a local photographer, Rossi, who have either taken over 1 or 2 days, had all these Treaty 4 heads, people, and chiefs in his studio. And to have them up here together in the first time, I think is an important first step in this act of reclamation. A lot of them have not been named. Felicia has pulled together a binder. She has some of the names in there. Some are probably misspelled. Some are probably phonetic writing, which you see a lot in captions of people just phonetically spelling out what they think the names are. Some of them might be nicknames. But I'm hoping that through the end of this process, that people from the Treaty 4 area are going to say, that's my great-grandfather, that's my great-uncle, that woman is my great-auntie. And we'll start to get the names, and we'll start to bring the context, and this will be part of the process of bringing those photos home. So that, in short, is kind of what the project has been about so far.
Crystal assured me that I'd have some perfect segue.
I was going to have one ready, just in case.
I can segue. Much of what you talked about is the work that I do, but it doesn't manifest in that artwork that I create. So most people wouldn't, by lack of, you wouldn't know that this is what the work is about. This is my great-grandparents, Jeannie and Willis Bowen, and they came to Canada with 38 other black people, black Indigenous people, in 1910. They crossed the border in 1910 at a time in which the Canadian government wasn't actively seeking black people to come to the country. And in fact, they had made a mistake by putting homestead ads in black newspapers in the United States, and oh shit, when the black folks showed up at the border, they had to come up with something quick. So what they came up with, and this petition is actually a very important part of the puzzle. So I guess my work is, one, a reclamation of the genealogy, the narrative of how we get here. It's two, a fact-finding practice to get past the notion of what my grandparents insisted, which is that everybody got along in northern Alberta. And it's factually impossible for that to be true, given the time frame that they came up. And that petition is a perfect example of it. So the Boards of Trade, led by Frank Oliver, who was the Minister of the Interior at the time, generated this petition that's 4,300 signatures of white Albertans that were adamant that Prime Minister Laurier block these people from coming into the country, and if they did not, they would be obliged to resort to lynch mobs, understood to be killing these people. Again, these are my kin. We made it through, and one of the freak discoveries in that petition in Lisa Meyer's Carry Forward exhibition was we presented it in that show, and I, quite honestly, was more interested in the gross numbers of it all, the appearance of the mass of it all. I wasn't really paying attention to who these people were. But one of the registrars, when installing the piece, had caught a signature, which is what this is about. One of the signatures was a gentleman named Barker Fairley, who, if you know the Group of Seven painters, Barker Fairley was the German scholar and art historian who had promoted the relevance of the Group of Seven. So my practice builds on this question of, well, what does it mean if Barker Fairley, arguably the architect of the Group of Seven, what does it mean if he's willing to sign a petition to kill Black Indigenous people? And what does that say about the work of the Group of Seven itself, right? And the absence of Black and Indigenous bodies in their work from the beginning to the very end, right? So that's where the work goes. I've done a number of exhibitions to kind of expand on that idea, but what I've provided tonight are just images for this show upstairs. But suffice to say that I've done the work, or one of the things that's important about the petition is to imagine it as a map, right? It is a document that has the signatures of people that live in a similar region and share similar values and ideas. And if you borrow from that logic and trace the networks of people, then you can start tracing what the things that they did. So if Frank Oliver, by example, signed that petition numerous times, along with a whole bunch of other fabulous people, fabulous white racist people. What does it mean then if Barker Fairley goes to U of T and teaches after he was at University of Alberta and he stays there until he retires, right? An honored scholar, German scholar, what does it mean about that? And he also got hired, he was working with Vincent Massey and the Group of Seven and all those characters at U of T in the 1920s. And he ultimately, for this exhibition at the very least, hired the gentleman at the center of that cluster, a guy named Carroll Aikens. And he was a nationalist, white nationalist playwright who produced a horrible red-faced play that I normally when I work with archives, I would reenact a theatrical piece. Except that this piece was so deeply racist that I couldn't do it, and then we decided to deconstruct it. So that's the one thing, and then from there, I mean, the pleasure of taking apart the master's house, it was lovely. It was a gift. They paid me money. I was happy. And then I took the documentation of that and I used it at the Berlin Biennale to try and make a connection between that Toronto narrative and Berlin. And it seems like an odd kind of thing to try to do, but I knew that I had an exhibition in Kitchener-Waterloo, formerly known as Berlin, Ontario. And I wanted to try and make a connection between Toronto and Berlin in Germany and then Berlin in Ontario. And you would think there's no way that you could do that, except that you can. The common denominator is Queen Victoria, and everything that I'm talking about, everything that is unpacked in this exhibition, other exhibitions, is happening within Queen Victoria's reign, right? So, as an example, this is one of the arguments that I tried to make visually, at least in the Berlin project, is that this, on the one hand, is Queen Victoria and all of her children. Queen Victoria is understood to be the grandmother of Europe. Her children, her 9 children, married into other monarchies. And that's a bigger conversation about a consolidation of power and wealth, right? And at the other is, it's a petition from the Six Nations protesting against the Indian Act. And we never really kind of think about the two of them in relationship, except that they're very much in relation, right? And so if you continue with the logic that most of, certainly my narrative anyhow, is within Queen Victoria's reign and of course in her children, grandchildren's reign, much of what the archival kind of, my archival impulse is trying to illustrate that the truth is right in front of us, right? It's not like these white people were kind of keeping their ambitions from us. They were always, the white people talk to white people. And they were explaining to each other what their ambitions were for a white Canada as an extension of the Commonwealth. And that's where my family's narrative comes into it. That petition is very much in support of Queen Victoria and subsequently her son, their mandates, and Canada's aspirations to be part of that Commonwealth, the white nation, right? Which brings us to this exhibition, which is very much a reflection of Kitchener-Waterloo. It's something that I like to do, which is to kind of leave a gift behind for the communities that I'm not from, right? My practice is to dig up the dirt. I know how to do it well, I guess. It's a skill set, I guess. And I have to actually, let me back up. I should actually kind of clarify that. I come from a criminal class of people, and so when I say that I am digging up, you know, what I'm doing, I mean that earnestly, and my approach to the practice comes from an underclass perspective. I would say it's forensic, and it's from the bottom looking up. In the way that, you know, a housekeeper knows what the patrons are doing all the time. You know what I'm saying? It's like, that's what I'm talking about, right? And this is the way that I go about the way that I research. So, as I had mentioned, Kitchener-Waterloo is formerly Berlin, Ontario, and that was a super rich place to engage with this show. You can move forward one more. So, I'll work with Berlin, Ontario until 1916. Berlin, Ontario is understood to be a German Mennonite pacifist town, Oktoberfest, beer, all that business. True. But German mercenaries hired by the British in the American Revolution precedes it, and those German mercenaries were the people that cleared the land for the Mennonites to settle on. So there's already a falsehood that's in place with that place. Add to it that Berlin is just down the way from the Detroit border, the Canadian-US border, and the Underground Railroad flows through that. And there was something like 30, 40 all-black settlements that was there prior to 1920, and then of course they all disappear in a matter of 20 years. There's an image up in the gallery, a slave oral history. One is Sophia Pooley, and the other one, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he talks about how former slave settlements and their land was being taken away from them because they didn't have literacy and they didn't know how to do numbers, right? So white people were literally thieving from them, stealing their land from them. So there was all but like 5 black settlements in southern Ontario left right now. All the others are disappeared, the history's gone, people don't know anything about black people. Canada maintains this notion that we're not here at all. We live in igloos, all that stuff, all that business. So what I wanted to do is kind of really just unpack this. What is Kitchener-Waterloo about? If you follow the narrative of Berlin and its name change to 1916, it really is about a conversation about the German sentiment is waning during the First World War. Kitchener-Waterloo, southern Ontario, is basically a region full of young, white, indigenous, black men that opt to serve in the First World. So many bodies lost in that region, so much blood in the soil in that region. And so I wanted to tell that story about how in 1916 German sentiment the British sentiment about Germans has waned, despite the fact that the royal family is German, but we'll come back to that another day. So y'all know I'm telling the truth, right? So So it's important to kind of go back to this place to kind of ask these questions about, okay, so what happened with that riot? So the short of it is that British soldiers lost their mind, rioted in the town, and there's this bust of Kaiser Wilhelm that goes missing a couple of times. It's a town thing. It's a tourist attraction, so to speak. Where did the bust go? But there's an interesting story. You start unpacking that, and you start unpacking why the sentiment turned, and you start unpacking things like, you know, all of the bodies that are lost. You start unpacking histories around like this, abolition in this region. I want to flag a couple of things in this image in particular. So we've got an image of John Brown in there a couple of times over, and he matters because I don't know if anybody knows American history, but the attack on Harper's Ferry is arguably the precedent to the Civil War. Most people don't know that John Brown conceived of that attack in Chatham, Ontario, right? And that there's a history of abolition and rebellion in Canada, let alone there's a history of former black slaves that are in the country, right, in that town. Add to it, you have the newspapers, black abolitionist newspapers that were being published in southern Ontario, out of Buxton and other regions. Harriet Tubman ended one of her last freedom journeys in Ontario. The fact that we don't know these things, right? That Harper's Ferry, Uncle Tom, all of these narratives that have been told to us as American concepts, but they're actually rooted in Ontario and they've been wiped out, right? So this is the stuff I'm interested in, and all of this is happening in Berlin, Ontario, Berlin/Kitchener. Can you give me another one? So this is an example of some of the other things that I was trying to unpack in the region. Of course, there's the petition that I had mentioned in its glory, and it's here in this instance as an evidence of white terrorism. And another chapter is, the other one is slavery on the far right. These are aspects of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Obviously, this is a very famous Wedgwood dish that holds the emblem of a former slave with the narrative of am I not a man and a brother, which is kin to Ain't I a Woman with Sojourner Truth. So I'm caught up in all of these artifacts. And by the way, I should mention that all of these things are purchased on eBay, which is messed up, including these shackles. A couple of pair of shackles that I had retrieved. And so I'm trying to make connections between these physical objects that are abhorrent. They're horrible. But I can make connections between archival images that can place them and can give you a date on when they were being created and those kinds of things. And of course, that gives me an opportunity to talk about the industry of slavery with slave auction houses and stuff like that. This is a chapter, Black Drones, which really is an opportunity for me to introduce this concept. What is a black drone? It's basically working class workers, laborers, I don't want to say insignificant, but insignificant black people, because that's not true. But they're people that were not considered of a particular worth or value. They were just there to do the things that they did. They were dispensable in the ways that slaves were, right? And so I wanted to bring that to the fore to illustrate the other black bodies, the other black drones in the region. And then it was an opportunity for me to introduce my family members into that constellation, because it was literally a way for me to understand how they would have been read in their time. So when you go upstairs, you'll see my grandfather, my grandmother, my great aunt, my great uncle. You'll see my great great grandmother, and they're all situated in this constellation because they would have been alive in that time and they would have experienced a very comparable thing. Yeah? In the middle, there's, can you go back a second? Charles Ellison was doing the horn piece. No, nobody's going backwards. Charles Ellison is a gentleman that is performing the taps piece upstairs. He's a relative of Ralph Ellison, and I met him in the first month that I moved to Montreal, and I thought it was a sign. So it's a super important thing for me. And then, of course, the other image is a Jubilee promenade with blacks in Amherstburg, celebrating the Jubilee celebration. The war. My family fought in the First World War in a black regiment called the No. 2 Construction Battalion. a deeply unwanted black regiment that was put together largely because Canada had lost as many white bodies as they had during the war. So they needed new bodies, and so they created a regiment for blacks, and they created a number of regiments for Indigenous people as well. They were never treated as equally as other white military people, certainly not as well as John Massey, or Vincent Massey and Lauren Harris, who managed to sit out the war. He's mentioned there as well. And then these are, of course, just artifacts that I had collected along the way to speak to the number 2 Construction Battalion, the Indigenous Battalion, and of course the White Battalion that all come from Southern Ontario. Beneath this is a chronology in coins, a lineage of Queen Victoria to her son, to her grandson, et cetera, already going all the way down to Elizabeth, and thinking about the fact that there are no black bodies on coins except for the abolitionist coin that has the body of a black slave begging for humanity. So, you know, I'm thinking about those things. I was also caught up in the ways in which Indigenous peoples were reduced to miniatures through these military kind of toy figurines, and you can find all kinds of British battles that with Indigenous or racialized people, and I find the whole phenomena to be quite messed up, right? So this, of course, is paraphernalia from battles with Joseph Brant, Mohawk chief. Here are 2 things. One is a trumpet that's supposed to be speaking to an image upstairs of the number 2 Construction Battalion's jazz band, which was their recruitment strategy to get blacks into that regiment. The Canadian government didn't support it, but they did it anyhow. And so the way that they got blacks to join was going from town to town and having some kind of a jazz gig or something like that. And then that was the way they got people to join. And then beneath that is a bugle from the Boer War. And that, of course, matters because that's Canada's big moment on the global landscape. This is when they enter into I guess, a more global kind of engagement on behalf of the Commonwealth. And it matters also because this is a battle in which they went and slaughtered a whole bunch of black people and introduced concentration camps long before the Germans did in the Second World War. This is an image, this is a celebration of cityhood. This is a commemoration of Berlin's anniversary of becoming a city in 1912. And I wanted to flag this particular image of the Kaufman rubber factory because, one, in the original iteration of the exhibition, we had a boot, photographed by another contemporary artist with a boot from that factory. And we included it because, again, this region is black, indigenous, 6 nations down the way. So you got the Underground Railroad, all that stuff. But Robert Kaufman was a eugenicist and was known for forcibly sterilizing 1,000 of his workers in that factory. And of course, that would connect to the other people that had been forcibly sterilized or put into the poorhouse or the, what was the House of Refuge? Waterloo House of
Industry and Refuge.
Thank you.
Sorry.
And all of this aligns with the time frame in which Canada and most of North America was creating homes for boys, residential schools. All of these things are all part and parcel of a means to weed out the classes of people that were not acceptable to the British Commonwealth and, of course, to Canada. So poor black people that fought in the war, not so much. Indigenous people, Indigenous laborers, not so much. And you also have to consider this is a time frame of industrialization as well, right? There's an excess of labor happening in this time frame. And what do you do with that labor? Literally. It's an interesting question to consider in its relationship to eugenics, in its relationship to University of Guelph's whole program on eugenics and that lasted until the 1930s and 40s, right? You have, this is a cluster that's speaking to the indigenous history of this landscape. This is making reference to the original map of the Haldimand Tract. This is the Brant family lineage in its totality, as well as the Johnson family through Superintendent Charles Johnson, I think, and his marriage to Molly Brant. And so just making kind of a constellation, a reference to the indigenous people that were in this landscape. And then after that, Crystal, this is the original, that's the boot that I'm referencing. And what this constellation also does is tells the story, of course, of the riot, the name change to Kitchener of all people. And who is Kitchener? That's Warlord Kitchener, who of course was the gentleman that introduced the concentration camps and the Boer War, but then also conquered all kinds of other places prior to that in the name of Queen Victoria. So why would anybody make a town into a place, rename a place as with a warlord, right, as its signatory? It's an interesting thing. So, and again, thinking about his relationship to the Boer War as well. And this is Sophia Pooley. This was one of the discoveries that I wasn't quite ready for, but thankful of, and it kind of references a conversation I was having out in the lobby about the ways in which Black and Indigenous histories are separate. So this is an oral history of a Black slave that was formerly owned by Mohawk Chief Joseph Brand. And she tells the story about her experiences living with him as though she was his own until his third wife, and she proceeded to beat her, and then Brand proceeded to sell her off to a white family by the name of Hat in that same region. It's important to name that connection to Black and Indigenous enslavement for a bunch of reasons. One is just the fact that it's true. Two is to perhaps complicate this notion of Black Indigenous solidarity that's practiced right now, because it's, again, much more complicated than that. And then it's also kind of speaking to my own history and my own work of trying to trace my Black Indigenous lineage, and the fact that that is the biggest secret in our community, more so than any other thing, is something that's compelling to me. So this work kind of is all in reference to my family history, and then a reflection of the history as it was. And then, of course, the oral history that's after that is the gentleman that speaks to the theft of the land. Above that is an Eagle song performed by my very good friend Archer Pachawis. He's probably the person that's known me the longest in my art career. He knew me when I was hanging on the streets. And he came forward and he performed this Eagle song for me, and he tells me that he was honoring, the logic of it was that the eagle is the most revered spirit, and that the song was meant to honor that eagle in the highest regard. And then I asked him a little bit further, and he also said, he spoke to the notion of the eagle referencing freedom, and that just resonated very deeply with me, this notion of freedom from bondage. And so the song is in conversation with Sophia, and of course that makes reference to kind of bigger notions around the Black communities that survived after her. But I'm deeply indebted to Sophia for that narrative, and I will flag the fact that I found that in an African American archive, not an Indigenous one. And I want to mention that also because there's something about doing this work in segregated archives and how there's a whole bunch of knowledge that gets lost in the in-between. And I guess in many ways, this is a project that embodies that, yeah? One other thing I want to mention about all of this work is I work with white archives for the most time. For lots of reasons. One being that trying to trace Black bodies prior to 1860 is impossible. We are property, we are not named, we are nothing really in that regard. So trying to trace your lineage or anything like that prior to 1860 is somewhat impossible. So there's that. Finding Blackness in Canada is also somewhat impossible for the sheer fact that we were never introduced into the narrative. And then when we are always spoken to in comparison to the United States, in a sense of diminishing numbers, and that perhaps our oppression wasn't as violent or long-winded as the United States, so therefore our situation is not as bad, which is, well, I'm not going to swear. I already swore once. I'm not going to do it again. But suffice to say that, there's a lot of reasons in which Black bodies were erased from the Canadian narrative very consciously, and I think by nature of my family history and that petition, it's a fluke. It's a mess, but it's a fluke to have that piece of documentation because it's one of the few pieces of documentation of explicit anti-Blackness in Canada. But by having it has provided me this opportunity to open the conversation up much, much more broadly. And so what's been compiled here is white archives, white people talking amongst themselves, and I've just simply rearranged them in a way to better reflect my understanding of the world, right? I've always known that the story that's been told to me is not my story, that is not our family's story. This is not necessarily an inherently radical practice that I'm doing. I'm just trying to honor the narrative that was taught to me by my elders. And again, in the absence of images, in the absence of the archive, I've been obliged to use the archives that white people acknowledge and honor. And that has been a protection in a way because, if I were to bring to the table black archives, the argument would be, well, we didn't know about this, so how could we have possibly done anything about it, right? So again, white archives is a shortcut. It gets past the dismissive or the denial and the kind of wiggling out of it. It's like, no, y'all people, your people talk amongst yourself about what you did to us, and this is what I'm offering you, is an opportunity to come to terms with what you said about us, yeah? So that's where the work comes from. In the next 2 months, I have a major installation that will continue this narrative on the exterior of the National Gallery. It's the blackest thing they have ever seen. And it will continue, it carries on to do the job of unearthing the white nationalist ambitions of the National Gallery from its beginning to present day. So there you go.
Keep it on. Conversation. You have to keep it on. Keep the mic on. So, no mic drops yet. So I want to pick up on the notion of the gift, and that's because, well, for many reasons, because we've lived lives with these images separately and independent of their arrival here in this institution, and you both have unique relationships to the images that you bring together, you convene for us to experience. And when I think about, Deanna, your relationship with Sophia Pooley's history and the way you were thinking about the presence of that work, Archer's contribution is a gift to Sophia. It's a late gift, but it's a gift nonetheless. Mm-hmm. And for folks who have a chance to move through the exhibition, you will note instantly that there is a soundtrack for the exhibition. And it's not so much, I don't think that came together with an understanding that there is going to be these two musical components that form a soundtrack for the exhibition. They're two discrete works, but we, by virtue of the exhibition as a kind of envelope, experience them in concert. And that's a really beautiful thing that's unique to the presentation here at the Mackenzie. So when that was first conceived, the project was first conceived, Eagle Song and Sophia were in another room with works from the collection, right? So it almost feels like there's this other dialogue that exists between those two elements. And I'm thinking about, the present giving a gift to the past. And I wonder, here's a question for both you and Paul, is there a form of agency that is uniquely derived from working with archival imagery? So as artists and thinkers and activists, what is it about working in the archives? What is it that can be done in the archives that can't be done elsewhere? Paul, I think you're ready.
Yeah, and thank you, Deanna, for that. I want to segue on you in a second, but just to what you said, Crystal. I want to contextualize this firstly by saying, if we're looking at the history of photography in the Americas, we're associating it with the really becoming more commonplace in the 1850s, Matthew Brady's American Civil War. The first photographs were generally of dead Confederate soldiers. So death was the first topic, really, of photography in the Americas. It was the first thing that people saw in the newspapers, Brady's photos, etc. I mean, obviously there were portraits and stuff, but the American Civil War was impactful, it was bloody, and it, layered on many levels. From that thing, photography quickly became associated with Manifest Destiny, and this whole thing with Edward Curtis, who is still a contentious figure. There's people debating on either side of his framing of Indigenous people, which coincided with the eradication of the Buffalo Nation. It coincided with the reservation system and the imprisonment of Indigenous nations across the American West. And it also coincided with this, soon after that period, this growing nostalgia and for the American West. And President Teddy Roosevelt was one of the first people who famously said the only good Indian is a dead one. He cared if, actually Sherman, I think, was the first one to say it, and Teddy Roosevelt just liked it and thought, I'll just paraphrase that a bit. But Roosevelt also began to write about how a man finds his manliness, and you find that by going west. Go west, young man. And that became so much a part of Manifest Destiny, and so much a part of how the photography developed. So he had, on one level, you have Ansel Adams and other people like that, taking these romanticized portraits of the American West for Eastern audiences primarily, devoid of people. The people are either dead or they're on reservations or on reserves in Canada. So this, again, is this absence, right? It's the erasure of the fact that there were actually people living on these lands. It's the erasure of the genocide, not just against people, but against the Buffalo, obviously. And it's this romanticization of the American West and this idea of the vanishing race, which Curtis was an important proponent of. And the idea that Curtis had was, well, I got to get these pictures of Indians and all their regalia before they disappear and become totally assimilated. Obviously, Curtis's work is of value, I think, if we view it through a critical lens. But at the same time, we also know that he was going with a set goal in mind of what he wanted to capture and frame, and often that involved the quote-unquote stereotypical suitcase of regalia that he would bring around. So can you put on this headdress for me? So this idea of whether this is authentic, whether this is this idea of the noble savage, of the vanishing race, of the stoic warrior, all these cliches that are so persist to this day about Indigenous people. Sontag made an interesting comment that, with the advent of the camera came the tours, and then came the capturing of the American Indian into something that they can contain and package. And that was so much a part of photography. It graduated into Hollywood, of course. We were talking earlier about Westerns, and of course, this idea of the stagecoach and the Indians circle the wagons, all these wagon burners, all these things we know from that period, all are part of that popular culture that photography kick-started and then moving pictures graduated from. But I say this just because when I'm approaching this on the archival question, it's, okay, I know these photos are there. How do I find something that is not that actually shows how people were living, how people were adapted, how people were adapting, how people were taking up farming, all these other things that people were doing that did not fit within this romanticized image of the vanishing race. And that really became an important part of the project. And I think to liberate that idea of the Indigenous being this easily contained kind of image of regalia or of beads and feathers, all these things that we associate with that. The sad warrior on his horse as the sunset's going down, all those things, that are so much part of the myth of the American West and the Canadian West. So that was a segue into what I was trying to do with the imagery. And just while it's in my mind, on Deanna's point, in terms of Queen Victoria, I guess it's her grandson was the Prince of Wales, who came here to Regina in 1919. These photos that you're going to see upstairs, the Rossi photos, we believe were at his request so that he would have a collection of his loyal red subjects to take back to England. At the same time, we have to view it from the other side perspective. This is 1919, a time when the Indian Act, the pass system, the residential schools are all at their height. So these leaders who came from Treaty 4 did not come here to view themselves, I believe, as props, to be taken a picture of and brought over back to England, but as a chance to meet and strategize. And for me, this 1919 meeting was probably one of the first under the cover gatherings of chiefs and heads people to talk and strategize. So I would like to see that. I like to see that outside of the framework of seeing these pictures upstairs, all this was going on behind the scenes without any official approval. It was a chance to actually meet, to strategize, and to start to initiate the changes that we see so much today. So this idea of kind of breaking apart that stereotypical image of the photograph and its relation to white supremacy, as you mentioned, as its relation to specifically to Manifest Destiny, and its relation to this stereotypical image of the Indian, I think is very much something that the project has tried to counter within its framing. And just on the aspect of our favorite German royal family, the Prince of Wales obviously came here in 1919. There was a parade. There were floats. One of the floats we believe is some of the women who are the actual living witnesses to Treaty 4, which was signed 1875? 74, sorry. Treaty 6 was 76, so 74, yeah. That actually were witnesses to the 1874 treaty. So they would have, when you see them upstairs, they would be, I imagine, in their 80s already. So it's that survival and resilience, but it's also, in fact, that he would have taken these back to Buckingham Palace. I hope to do some research to find out where they actually were, but the catch is he was kicked out of the family because he married Wallace Simpson.
Okay.
And they kicked him in the ass. He's out. So whatever happened to his archives, I don't know yet. I don't know yet. That's what I have to look. I don't know what happens to members of the Windsor family when they get kicked out. Do they actually keep all their stuff?
Go to the Royal Trust. Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Yes. Sorry, sharing notes. Go to the Royal Trust. Specific to my research for the National Gallery project, the National Gallery was opened by the Marquis of Lorne and Princess Louise. And so what's interesting for me about the Royal Trust is that Princess Louise's archive is the only royal archive that is sealed to this day. My girl was like a feminist and was randy and was messing around, and Queen Victoria sent her to Canada in exile, right? And she had a snow toboggan accident and went back home, and then the Marquis of Lorne stayed and did all his fabulous business as Governor General. That is not what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about so many things. The mother proponent of your practice and how my practice is grounded in a conversation with my mother, who I'm caring for in her final days, months right now. And how my practice, much of the work that I'm doing right now is derived from 3 days of conversation with her in 2011. We had been estranged for a decade, and the deal was that we would come together and meet if she would take me to the places that she lived in Vancouver and tell me stories. So I recorded them, and that has been like the soundtrack to everything I've produced since, including this in some ways. So the mother component is very, very real for me. I want to talk also about what other fabulous things were you saying?
Well, maybe, can I jump in?
No, we were talking, no, you went,
No.
wait. I want to answer my question.
Okay, can I jump in?
Yes.
Please. I'm also just thinking about time here, and I know that folks are have burning questions, but
They want to go,
I thought we were on to midnight.
you were ready to leave before we started. You're funny.
You kind of said that. Yeah, you kind of said that.
I want to, well, actually, the question is, question picks up on where you're going, I think, Deanna, which is, you know, the relationship that your respective projects have with your family history. And, you know, that's, you know, mining deep into families is not always the easiest work to share with a broader public, and you found ways to learn through this exercise that involves knowledge gathering from other folks. And I wonder if maybe you can talk a little bit about how that learning is actually shaping the way that you're thinking about the function of the images you bring together.
What I remembered what I wanted to talk about was representation. You were speaking to the representation of Indigenous people. I was thinking about what this exhibition offers up is potentially what I think are the two possibilities of representation for the Black body. One is, of course, the death of the ever-faithful slave like an Uncle Tom, which is in that postcard that's at the beginning of the show. And then the other, of course, is, you know, the redemption through, you know, the abolition of slavery, and then of course you've got this fabulous kind of resurrection that ultimately falls down to kind of a return cycle of ultimately death again, right? There's just the death loop, so to speak, is what I'm very conscious of. And I would say that with my practice, again, because of who we are and the place and society that we have, I've always been very, very conscious of what we look like, right? And I spent the first 15 years of my practice not representing my body, my family with Black bodies, or even trying to attempt to do it in any kind of literal way. I was working with metaphor for the longest time, in part to protect them, because the things that I was working through at the time would have looked like every stereotypical anything that was out in the world around Black bodies. And so I learned a great deal in going against the grain and what audiences expected of me as a Black maker. Black makers make Black things. And so that was like the beginning of a pushback that I really started to kind of earnestly lean into by the time I got to this aspect of my career, right? The work is still very, very, very much about my family. All of these projects are working through opportunities in the sense of profound generational trauma. And the opportunity to open the project up to a broader history gives me a little bit of breathing room. There's only so many things I'm willing to sell of myself for my practice or for anything, really. And I think that my family, despite its class, deserves I think that they deserve a dignity that was never afforded to them. And because I've had the opportunity to do the research, I know that we were something else before we were what we became here. And I know what the forces were that contributed to the making of who we are and the quote-unquote stereotypical representation that would ultimately come from that. So that is in part another reason why I shifted my gaze towards what I'm calling, it's about my family, but in another way I would say what I'm doing is white studies more than it is inherently Black studies. And I think that we really need to, specifically if we're talking about photography, we really need to start talking about the white gaze and the veracity of photography for the first 150 years. These are, who had access to cameras at that time, at the beginning of photography, and what was it used for? And in my own teaching, I'm thinking about the ways in which photography was used to classify Black bodies. I'm thinking about the Zeely photographs and the way that you have these slaves that are obliged to pose nude for Agassiz and what the hell, it's horrendous to think about those things. But these are the concerns, right? And again, photography in my mind is not a factual practice. It is something that is manipulated by an individual in any given time. I don't believe in the notion of spontaneous photography, and I think that the tool itself does something to people, yeah? So I think the biggest challenge is working against that first 150 years I think for all communities that are not white and didn't have access at that time. And so I think that the practice, this journey of research has been an opportunity literally to throw a wrench into the mess, so to speak. I have an opportunity now teaching at a university to teach subsequent generations that what they've been taught about photography is fundamentally untrue. I love my job. And I think that, and then from there, teaching subsequent generations of how to find something to make something out of nothing, which is effectively, I think, both of our practices, right? Coming out of erasure and absence, and then figuring out the ways of getting through the archive. And I think in my case, it's obliged me to think like white people in order to find the blackness within it. Literally, for this show in particular, having to think about what were white people in Berlin, what language were they using at the advent of this town, and recognizing that it's not Negro, it's not black, it's a whole other language, right? But anyhow, the short of it all is just recognizing the fact that there's an enormous potential to protect and excavate and name names in the archive. And I think that that's what's most fascinating about me before we get feedback.
I don't have much to add to what Deanna just said, other than just on a personal note, and I think it's, in terms of family, and I'll talk from the family connection because that was what we were talking about. And you mentioned your mother. When I think back of my family, of course, my closest connection would be to my mother, but there was a no-go area, which was residential schools. Like I never, as I said at the beginning, I never pried her on that while she was around, and I have no regrets. And creatively, it was not where I wanted to go. Within this project, within what my work with dealing with photography, and particularly the indigenous image as it's been framed, but to find those things, as you say, that to use the white archives, the institutions, and to reframe them and challenge by finding those photos that are outside of the norm or outside of the expected. But it also means, conversely, that I'm not going into ceremony, I'm not going into residential schools, I'm not going into trauma-based stuff. I have no interest in, and even if I could find a way that I felt somewhat comfortable with, I still don't think I would ever do that in terms of an exhibition of residential school photos, for instance. There are places for that. There's a whole TLR in Ottawa, so I do occasionally get people sending me photos of Libret or other residential schools. I treat them with respect, I thank the people, and then I forward them to the folks in Ottawa, because that's their research, that's their work to do, and it's outside of the parameter of where I'm willing to go. And I think just the way we work, I think, is interesting for me. I don't know how you're on this with this, Deanna, but after a number of years, I just know what's good for me, my spirit, and I know, okay, I'm going to do these photos, but this is not what I want to go, and this is not, it's part of the reason I got out of, I hardly ever do journalism anymore, because I got tired of, how are you handling this? I can't do that anymore. It goes against who I am, and I have no intention of going there. So it's that issue of finding that balance of what I'm comfortable going with and what I feel fits in with the, I guess, the curatorial mind and whatever, however it is in here, of what I want to achieve. And if it's outside of that framework, it's not invalid to me, but it has to be dealt with somewhere else, and I kind of just forward that to it.
Yeah. I haven't quite figured out what to do with the trauma that comes with the work. And so Crystal can speak to this as well, the way that we put this project. Crystal's the first black curator I've ever worked with in my career. I'm 54 years old. I've been working for over 25 years. And that experience of working with Crystal was so profound, I have to say. Between the two of us, we were both kind of fact-finding and researching at the same time, but also holding each other up because it hurt like nobody's business to do this project. It's profound, it's just so painful. And I guess in a way, I imagine that that's my job, is to kind of process the things that come up. But I go there anyhow. So when we first started working together, I had mentioned, just as I was starting to get into the research, just beginning it, and I had a sense of how dark the history was, and I sent Crystal a message and I apologized because I said, this is where I think it's going to go, and it's just so damn dark and bloody, but I felt like I had to I'm following the material, right? I guess I haven't hit something quite yet that will stop me, though I will say that in the Trump years, I really struggled with unearthing white supremacy because I can see the networks. And again, speaking of family connections, it's not like I was looking to do work around white supremacy. It was just that my grandfather had taught me how to see them, right? And so that just is, again, a skill set that was passed on to me by necessity. And it's just, I feel like that Sixth Sense movie. I see white supremacists. I don't know.
Just as bad.
But again, it's not like I'm looking to do it, and I will say that I have been fearful in the last couple of years, but it's not been enough for me to stop doing the work. I still have the stamina for it right now, but I will admit that I've been on a break for the last 6 months because my brain hurt, right? It's intense work. Yeah.
And there is, there's something that, there's a kind of responsibility that will be placed on you both as artists, just as it is sometimes placed on curators, right? This recognition that, you seem morally sound enough to do that kind of difficult work, so we're just going to expect it of you all the time. And I know that's more likely to be a burden for artists than it is for curators, but we don't often stop to take stock of just how much of a toll that kind of work can take on folks, and you learn through it. You learn who your institutional allies are, who are the educators on your team who are ready to roll up their sleeves and do that hard work with you. You cry together sometimes, right? And you get some really good stories out of this work. And if we think, if I'm going to hurt this much, at least I better get a good story out of it. And I think before I open it up to questions, because I know I have to keep you on time, right? But I think back to the story about the Ontario Provincial Archives. And I'd love for you, Deanna, to kind of share that story, because it reminds us that there are ways that networks can open up for you in unexpected ways.
So the show came together during the pandemic. Libraries are closed. I'm buying everything I possibly can off of eBay, doing everything digitally online, all that stuff. And, how did he show up on my doorstep? I can't remember.
You asked for some images.
I know that part. Well, anyhow, the point of it, where it went is there are images in the exhibition from the Alvin McCurdy fawns, which is in the Ontario Archives. And there's a gentleman there named Sean Smith who is a rock star, and he has been digitizing black photography from the McCurdy fawn for some time. And then he also happened to be part of a group called GLAM, which, if you go to Wikipedia and if you do a search for GLAM, it's a portal of archivists and librarians who are doing this back-end renegade stuff of putting copyright-cleared photography onto Wikipedia. And so the Alvin McCurdy font is there, free for you to access. He came to me, Sean said, he told me about this archive, and it was like a nudge, nudge, wink, wink kind of an email where there were links embedded in it, and if I was paying attention, I would understand what he was trying to kind of lead me to. And I finally figured it out, and my God, the McCurdy images are just the most beautiful, painful images of slaves in southern Ontario. First Black townships, all of this important, lovely imagery of middle class, or better than working class families, Black communities that had established themselves with the churches, and all of that kind of stuff. And it was just over Christmas time, and I was kind of stuck and deeply overwhelmed by what he had gifted me with, and I had to sit for a while and come to terms with what he had gifted me. I had never really had to contend with the images of slaves that were in my neck of the woods, so to speak. And I was just so overwhelmed by the responsibility of that. And then at the same time, so very, very grateful and thankful that he thought that I could handle it. And he came through. I don't know this man. I've never met this man before in my life, but he was down with the archive, and he understood the importance of the fond, and he passed it on to me, and I've since sent my grad students who now work for him. That's a new discovery. And they pass me on information. I have a student as a plant now in the archive. And she sends me stuff. But I just can't say enough about this gentleman, that this is not his history, but he recognizes the relevance of this Black history, and he did that work to get it out there in the world, and I came into its path, and it's now here for you. And that's an amazing thing. Not every librarian is going to do that, or archivist is going to do that, but that one did, and I give him a shout out every time we talk about this show, because it's just so important, and it came at just the right time for this show to come into being.
That's a wonderful gift of punctuation you've given us, Deanna. Something coming at just the right time. Because I think that really distills what we try to do in our work, right? Is figure out how to bring conversations into the world at just the right time, at the time the world needs them, or a time that our world needs them. I am so deeply grateful for just getting to listen, really, to you both, and to listen to others as they get a chance to experience your work upstairs. So on behalf of the team here and all our warm bodies in the room, thank you so much, both of you, Paul and Deanna.